Good afternoon. I'm Krzysztof Jacek, and I have the pleasure to welcome, first of all, our guest speaker, Ambassador Jacek Hinz. Well, there's a long story since we know each other. This was the Iberian Studies Department, I guess, but you are not my students. Oh, you?
I'm not sure, actually.
But it's
maybe sometimes.
Maybe a little bit. But then we joined our forces at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. But first passion of Jacek Hinz, Ambassador Hinz, was journalism. So he was very passionate journalist working for different newspapers and Polish press agency in Cuba and in Mexico. He attended the very difficult moments in the history of these both two countries. So he was experienced reporter and journalist. He did a couple of nice works for Gazeta Wyborcza too, but probably this experience opened to him another field, which was diplomacy. So Ambassador Hinz is a good example of those who switch from one profession to another, which is actually very close. He served as first the counselor in Cuba, and I know that this was a very special experience. I will not get into the details because I'm sure he will tell you a couple of stories when he became a hero of the opposition, and Fidel Castro was naming him during one of his speeches as an enemy, unfortunately. Then he served as ambassador to Brazil, the biggest Latin American country, and he also fulfilled his mission in the ministry as a director, as a deputy director of Americas Department. Later on, he was appointed an ambassador to Venezuela. So his recent experience was particularly fruitful. Working in circumstances that are politically risky is a very special task. Ambassador Hinz was very good in that. Probably this is part of his spirit, challenging the situations. And what is worth to note, he wrote a book quite recently on Cuba, on his Cuban experience, which is called Cuba.
Syndrome of Island.
Syndrome of Island, or Syndrome Wyspy. So to the very special situation of Cuba through political changing situation. I will not keep you awaiting his speech. We welcome you again, Jacek, and it's an honor to us to have you here. Welcome.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, my English is not so good as the English of my friend, Ambassador Ryszard Schnepf. But anyway, I hope it will be able to establish communication. I'm sorry to be a little bit late, but I left my glasses a few yards from here in my car. So, and I don't accustom that I should have them always. Well, the subject of my speech is crisis in Venezuela, why it matters. Trying to answer the question, I would mention 5 elements. Because of course the subject is very open and we could speak about this, hours and hours, but I would like just to speak about 5 elements. First of them is that the astonishing fact that once wealthy Latin American country became one of the poorest countries in the region. Maybe only Haiti is in worse situation. The second, no doubt we are facing the biggest humanitarian crisis in the continent's history. What one can really observe in Venezuela is the military dictatorship, with democratic facade, although nobody speaks about this openly. The fourth, fortunately, the Cold War belongs to the past, but the crisis in Venezuela has become a part of proxy war between Cuba, Russia, and China to some extent on one side and the United States on the other. And the fifth element is also astonishing. In the beginning of May this year, we were assured by the media that the Venezuelan crisis is over. Television showed crowds controlling the streets of Caracas. But maybe the greatest of historical fallacies is to confuse crowd with power. One can see the limitations of the crowd. Saying this, I would like to explain a little further. Let's have a look on Venezuela. It's a country nearly 3 times bigger than Poland, with a population of about 30 million inhabitants. Although now it's difficult to count how many inhabitants because of strong wave of migration. Venezuela is the 7th largest country in Latin America and used to be the 5th largest economy in Latin America. Due to its strategic geographical location, Venezuela is a bridge between South America and the Caribbean. It has the largest proven oil reserves in the world, more than the Saudi Arabia. Though the type of oil extracted here requires advanced processing technology. It also has deposits of natural gas, in fact also one of the biggest in the world, not exploited until now, which were not exploited. It has coal, iron ore, aluminium, bauxites, gold, diamonds, uranium, and other minerals, whatever you wish. The Orinoco River basin provides Venezuela with abundant hydroelectric resources. One could say this is a paradise. There have also really magic places, very nice for tourism, which you can't find in any other place, in any other places of the planet. Before the so-called Bolivarian Revolution, Venezuela had a relatively well-established democracy and was one of the richest countries in Latin America, although the riches were not equally shared. Caracas at that time was a chic South American capital city, vibrant and boasting the ultra-modern communication and transport solutions, often adopted from the US. The country attracted immigrants from Europe. From the European perspective, Venezuela is important because of its direct links with the old continent. Several million Venezuelans belonging to the migrant communities of Spaniards, Italians, and the Portuguese. Venezuela has, in fact, one of the largest Portuguese migrant communities outside Portugal, have European roots, often in the first or second generation. Hundreds of thousands of Venezuelans have EU passports. In Venezuela, there were newspapers published in Portuguese and Italian. Even in my time, when I was ambassador accredited to Venezuela until 2012, I could see this and read these newspapers. Venezuela also has direct connections with the Middle East. Hundreds of thousands of Venezuelans have Syrian or Lebanese roots. Hundreds of thousands of Colombian refugees sought shelter in Venezuela during the armed conflict in Colombia. Until recently, it was estimated that this community numbered about 3-4 million people, most of whom had Venezuelan citizenship. Immigrants from Peru, Uruguay, and other Latin American and Caribbean countries have also flooded into Venezuela. After Hugo Chavez won the presidential elections at the end of 1998, His government seized private factories, mines and fields and founded state companies and cooperatives. The constant juxtaposition of the rich and the poor, the continuous attacks on the oligarchy, the expropriations and nationalizations of properties resulted in a significant polarization of society. High oil prices, in fact, it's a little bit different nowadays because it was very visible when I was in Venezuela, this polarization of society. One part of half of Venezuelans were against Hugo Chavez, and another half supported, or even more, supported Hugo Chavez and Bolivarian revolution. It's never more. Although there are still Venezuelans who support Bolivarian revolution, but they can't answer why. They can't say why. They still support, but let's say these are about 20–30%. High oil prices contributed at the time of Hugo Chavez to a short-term reduction in inequality and poverty, as social programs made food, housing and health care more widely available. Meanwhile, most of the sectors of the economy were systematically destroyed. The Venezuelan economy became even more dependent on oil, 90% of export earnings, and on imports of most basic foodstuffs. In fact, this dependency on oil, it's nothing new, because it was all the same before Bolivarian era. I remember once in the diplomatic reception, I met a noble, distinguished lady, and I started to speak with her, and I was telling her about my journey from Ciudad Bolivar to Caracas. It's about 500 kilometers. And I told her, look, I was traveling with my son, and he wanted to go to the toilet, but it was absolutely impossible. Wherever we stopped, there was no water, there was no possibility to make use of the toilet. How it's possible that the country with such touristic possibilities doesn't have any infrastructure? And she said to me, look, Mr. Ambassador, I know this. I was the Minister of Tourism in the Fourth Republic. Oh my God, I say, I'm so sorry. No, she said, don't worry. It was exactly like this. Also at that time, once I spoke about this during the meeting of the ministers, that we should do something to make bigger our tourism, and they said, no, but what are you worrying? We have petrol. So in some way it's nothing new, but now it comes to the extreme that there is absolutely nothing, but only a little bit of, because I will speak about this later, it's much less petrol that they extract than before. At the same time, a new heavily corrupt ruling elite, so-called Bolivarian bourgeois, Boliburguesia in Spanish, was formed. And they found the current political system highly convenient. What worked in their favor was the strict state control over the economy, fixed prices, and the artificially sustained and undervaluated dollar, which gave great opportunities for speculation and corruption. When oil prices started to fall at the beginning of last decade, the problems began and started to be more and more visible. Government mismanagement, corruption, and the lack of investments in oil industry and all other economic sectors were the source of the country's economic disaster. The Venezuelan GDP shrank by over half between 2014 and 2018. The oil production decreased from 3.5 million barrels per day 20 years ago to less than 8,000 barrels now. Inflation rate has reached something incredible, 1.7% in 2018. And this year, according International Monetary Fund, it can even reach 10 million %, becoming one of the worst cases of hyperinflation in modern history. It was a surprise just 1 week ago, I think, that the Central Bank of Venezuela published for the first time since, I don't know, 2013, I think, some dates and admitting the situation, economic situation of Venezuela. According to, and one who could read this could see in very clear that absolutely the disaster can't be explained by economic sanctions of the United States. That this is the result of the governance and nothing else. But the same central bank says, and some observers, that maybe this hyperinflation this year will not reach 10 million %, but maybe a few million less. But in fact, it doesn't change the situation. The minimum salary barely amounts to a few dollars. 8 out of 10 people live in poverty. In the once prosperous nation, people now find themselves unable to provide for their most basic needs. Hunger is widespread and children are dying of malnutrition. The country's public health care system has collapsed and prolonged electricity outages are common. The second element, which is very distinctive for the situation of Venezuela, is that we witness to the biggest humanitarian crisis in the continent's history. Deteriorating political, economic, and humanitarian situation in Venezuela is the main reason of the growing wave of emigration. According to the United Nations, some 3.7 million people have left Venezuela since 2014, and until the end of this year, this amount can grow to 5 million people. The majority of them settling in Colombia, Peru, Ecuador, and Brazil. This is the biggest migration crisis in the history of Western Hemisphere, comparable with the Syrian crisis. At the same time, this is the biggest threat to the stability of the Latin America and the Caribbean region. Third element, military dictatorship without democratic facade. The militaries have played a leading role in political and economic life of Venezuela since ex-colonel Hugo Chavez came to presidential power in 1999. In fact, it was President Hugo Chavez who created, during 14 years of his presidential power, the military dictatorship under democratic facade. He gave power to the generals, who have changed military uniforms into suits. His successor, Nicolas Maduro, who took the presidential office in 2013, made the alliance with the army still stronger. Militaries held the posts in the government, in states' governances, and they are heads of the state petrol company PDVSA and other state enterprises. They control nearly everything, incomes of the state and the distribution of financial resources, food and medicines. There are about 2,000 generals in Venezuelan military forces, which consist of 230,000 persons, more or less. It means that there is more or less one general for every 100 soldiers, something incredible. The high-ranking militaries control not only legal activities. They are accused of corruption and involvement in drug trafficking. Corruption on the scale of Venezuela is a threat for regional peace and stability and security also. During the authoritarian regimes, both President Hugo Chavez and his successor Nicolas Maduro have been consequently limiting the independence of all branches of power. And in difference to Poland, there are four powers in Venezuela: executive, legislative, judicial, and electoral, which is also considered as a branch of power apart. After years of absence in the National Assembly, the opposition won the parliamentary elections in 2015 and gained the absolute majority, 2/3 of seats. However, the Supreme Tribunal of Justice questioned the legality of the election of a few deputies, started to consider the Assembly's legal acts as unconstitutional, and finally declared the Constitutional Chamber of the Tribunal to take over the Parliament's role. After a series of social protests and internal pressure on his government, Maduro was forced to return to the Assembly its constitutional legislative power. Shortly after that, Maduro called new elections for the Constitutional Assembly, which were boycotted by the opposition. There was low turnout, only 42% more or less, and many members of the international community. Many Latin American countries, the United States, EU, and Canada didn't recognize the Constitutional Assembly, whose main purpose was to block the National Assembly, the Parliament. At that point, the only democratically elected in free and legal elections institution in Venezuela. As if that was not enough, in May 2018, the illegal, as many experts claim, Constitutional Assembly called early presidential elections. The deadlines necessary for proper procedures were not kept, and the opposition's candidates couldn't run even for the offices. Many leaders of the opposition were arrested or had to leave the country. So it was really an incredible situation, and as expected, Nicolas Maduro won. Maduro started a second term on January 10th, following a widely boycotted election last year that many foreign governments refused to recognize. On January 23rd, Juan Guaido, leader of the opposition-controlled National Assembly, from the party which is called Voluntad Popular, Popular Will, let's say, declared himself interim president of Venezuela and declared Maduro's presidency illegitimate. Shortly after this, US President Donald Trump recognized him as the country's leader. Guaido was recognized as the interim, in fact, very young interim president. He's 35 years old, and before this, he wasn't even known for many Venezuelans. It was like a big surprise for many of them, and many coincidences that he was elected the president of National Assembly, and that he could declare himself the interim president, on the basis that Maduro was illegally sworn. He wasn't sworn, he should be sworn according to the constitution in the National Assembly, but he was sworn in the Supreme Judiciary Tribunal. So it's against the constitution, and the whole electoral process was also unfair. Meanwhile, Guaido was recognized as the interim head of state by over 50 countries, among them 24 EU countries, Poland included, and most of the countries from the region. Canada, Brazil, and Argentina included. Meanwhile, Maduro claims that he will not give up power until the end of his 6 years mandate, let's say in 2025. Yes. Actually, there is now double presidential, legislative, and judicial power in Venezuela. There is de facto regime of Maduro and interim President Guaido. There is National Assembly and Constitutional Assembly. There is, finally, judiciary system controlled by Chavistas and Venezuela Tribunal of Justice in exile with headquarters in Bogota. They usually have sessions in form of video conferences. They even condemned Maduro for many years of prison, and he should pay $32 billion. But of course, they will. It's impossible to execute. The fourth element, which I would like emphasize, is proxy war. The majority of Latin American countries doesn't support Nicolas Maduro. He can, however, rely on unconditional support from Cuba, Nicaragua, and Bolivia because of its dependence on oil shipments from Venezuela. Cuba is probably the most interested in keeping the status quo. The current Venezuelan regime is therefore guarded by estimated 20,000 of Cuban militaries and security officers who occupy many command posts in Venezuelan armed forces and other units working under the Ministry of Interior Affairs. Mexico, in fact, is the only major Latin American player that tries to stay neutral. A dozen countries from the region form the Lima Group, among them Argentina, Brazil, Chile, Colombia, Peru, and Canada. The group advocates for a firmer approach to Maduro's regime, one that would force him to stand down. The EU countries established the International Contact Group, ICG, which consists of 8 EU countries and 4 Latin American countries. ACG aims to find a peaceful solution to the Venezuelan crisis. Norway decided to play the role of the mediator. In fact, Norway has very great experiences as far as the Colombian conflict goes. There are mediators in Colombian conflict, which Colombian civil war during a long time, which came to the end. And Norway managed to organize in Oslo 2 meetings between Maduro's representatives and the opposition. Until now, there are no visible results. The current crisis in Venezuela is a part of broader international political game, which can heavily influence any possible solutions. Maduro's main allies are Russia and China. Both countries have invested a lot in Venezuela, especially in the oil sector. It is estimated that Russian oil companies, especially Rosneft, have invested in Venezuela around $15 billion. At the same time, Venezuela's debt to China is so big that even if paid in oil shipments, it will take Venezuela decades to pay off. Russia, though, has additionally military ties to Venezuela. Arms supplies from Russia to Venezuela reached $11 billion. Russia's military presence in Venezuela is supposed to put pressure on Washington as a part of a broader conflict between Russia and the West. Even though the Cold War has long passed away, we are witnesses to a kind of proxy war in which Russia's adversary are the United States. What is more, Washington counts Venezuela among the so-called troika of tyranny, alongside Cuba and Nicaragua, that destabilizes the whole region. At the same time, the United States do not agree to Russian military presence so close to its border. The last element which I would like to describe are the limitations of the crowd and possible scenarios. In the end of April, Juan Guaido announced the Operation Liberty. Thousands of Venezuelans took to the streets of Caracas and other cities. The expectation was that Guaido had infiltrated the army and plotted a coup. He assured that army was on the right side, I mean on the side of Venezuelan people. Clearly, this assumption was wrong. Supported by Americans, Guaido miscalculated. Only some part of Venezuelan intelligence, some commanders of intelligence took part of the opposition. But the army in general supported Maduro, although there were some officials, as I said, who changed sides. The opposition was forced to retreat. Venezuela has disappeared from the headlines because its headlines were about crowds, not about the realities of power. The trouble with crowds is that sooner or later they go home. We have in mind good examples, for instance, what happened in Istanbul a few years ago, what happened in Tehran. Nothing happened what one could expect. Power in a democracy emanates from the ballot box, but in the absence of the ballot, maybe there are only the guns. After failed liberty operation, Guaido has to face three threats: repressions by the facto regime of Nicolás Maduro, whose main target has recently been the National Assembly, discontent of the opposition caused by the defeat, and tiredness of Venezuelans who have gone back to the business of surviving. It is difficult to predict scenarios for the end of the crisis. The best way, I would say as a diplomat, remains the same: political, peaceful, and democratic solution agreed between the main Venezuelan stakeholders, the de facto regime and the opposition. But this solution is vanishing with the strategy of repression by the de facto regime of Nicolás Maduro and no wish to retreat. Juan Guaido and the Washington administration repeat that the only thing to negotiate with Nicolás Maduro is the conditions of his departure, despite threatening rhetoric of Donald Trump and his advisors that all options are on the table. Military intervention of the USA is, in my opinion, rather unlikely. It would be very bad received by most of the Latin American countries, which remember very well the US military interventions in the past. It seems that the economic and financial sanctions are the main strategy by which the Trump administration aims to force Maduro out of office and help Guaido replace him with a transitional government that organizes new presidential elections. In fact, maybe it's a strategy, but very often we can perceive that behind the strategy, very often we can see the very chaotic reactions of the United States. Maybe there is even no strategy, but only the plan of sanctions. The sanctions are really strong because at this moment, practically, before I speculated that maybe the United States, who was once the most important destination of Venezuelan petrol, and the main resource of money, because the rest of petrol Venezuela was sending to China, to Cuba, and wherever, and as a part of as an exchange for credits. So without any money, it was only United States until recently that paid with money for Venezuelan petrol. Now it's practically impossible because the Washington administration introduced a law which says that all incomes from the petrol should go to the accounts of President Guaido. So they can't go to Maduro regime. Still, there are some other sanctions which make it much more difficult to transport petrol to the United States. The United States put sanctions on Venezuelan PDVSA, which has its under company in the United States. So the situation is really difficult, and Venezuela nowadays has no even gasoline. There are big queues, not at this moment, not in Caracas, but in many parts of Venezuela. People are queuing to get some gasoline. The Venezuelan factories should produce like 1 million gasoline per year. Now it's less than 300 barrels, per day. So it's really dramatic situation. The dimension of the crisis, which almost certainly gets worse with crippling US sanctions, is beyond their understanding, and it should rather come to the end this year, in my opinion. How long it can last, I don't know. It seems impossible that the Venezuelans still survive. It can happen any day, although it's difficult to predict when. Maduro retains the loyalty of most of the militaries, but it can change as there are divisions in the files of his supporters, so-called Chavistas. There were rumors that Maduro was ready to flee to Cuba, but he was not allowed to do this by Russians. Maybe it's true. Maduro has not enough charisma, nor popularity to stay in power. He is a hostage of Cubans' corrupt ruling elite, especially militaries, and of the Bolivarian revolution's myth. Maduro still can count on his important allies as Russia and China. Nevertheless, both of them, especially China, have economic interests also in other Latin American countries, whose pressure can be decisive. And in fact, I think, although being a diplomat of Poland and the EU country, I think that Latin American countries, in this case, can make much more pressure on Maduro's regime than we can, because of many of the mentioned migration crisis, which they suffer very strongly, because of their problems which are created by Venezuela, and because of their economic relations. Military presence of Russia in Venezuela is rather part of political pressure on the United States. President Putin knows that Washington will not accept for a long term Russian military engagement so close to the US borders. Russia could eventually make concessions receiving in exchange guarantees for its oil investments in Venezuela, and making Washington close its eyes on Ukraine. Meanwhile, as the political stalemate continues, little has been done to rectify the situation for everyday Venezuelans. I would stop in this moment, but maybe our discussion would be more interesting and we could speak about some other elements. Just I'll give you the floor for the questions. Thank you.
Yes, Ambassador Hinz. David Jones, I teach foreign policy here. Question for you. Specifically, do you feel that the Trump administration should keep the sanctions going, A, B, increase the sanctions, or C, reduce them? Because from part of what you're suggesting, the sanctions are hurting the people. So that would be my basic question.
Well, it's very difficult a little bit to answer this question. I will give you example of Poland. When the martial law was imposed, then we lost privileged conditions of our imports and exports with the United States. And it was considered as sanctions. And if you ask anybody in the street, is it bad for us or not? Anybody would tell you it's okay. It's better than they impose these sanctions. Then the communist government can fall as quick as possible. A little bit it's similar nowadays in Venezuela. How long it can last, what worse can happen. There are many even Venezuelans who say that the best solution will be the military intervention. You can hear this in the streets when you speak with Venezuelans, or especially with Venezuelan immigrants. Even I know some of them in Poland who speak in this way. It's the best, of course, the best solution, it would be to convince in some way Maduro to step down, but it seems very difficult. So if not the military intervention, I think that sanctions are correct.
Do you think that nowadays support from the outside helps? I mean, for example, in the healthcare field, for example, doctors from Palestine comes there and earn like $1,000 when local doctors earn like $10 per month. So local doctors are moving to Colombia or another country, and in fact, this support doesn't help, in my opinion. But I'm asking about your point of view.
Well, but it's the obligation of I think of international community to give humanitarian aid, to do anything possible to that the humanitarian aid reaches the Venezuelan. Of course, there are cases, as you say, that but for instance, the basic medicines, for instance, food. Many things which can at least make the suffering of people not so strong. So the only problem until now was that finally it was possible to pass the humanitarian aid to Venezuela, but from the very beginning the Maduro's regimes says that there is no need of such humanitarian aid. That it's not true that there is such dramatic situation. So this is really criminal attitude. And but in case of international community and the United Nations and the EU, I think that it's now our obligation to try to send humanitarian aid as much as possible.
Yeah, I have a question. Since you say you've talked to average Venezuelans and they've pinned their hopes on on a military intervention? Are they clear that they want a US intervention?
Yes, surprisingly, even for me, yes, whatever. They say once, quickly, and that's all. And then they can go home. This is the opinion of some persons which I heard. So it's not my invention. And it's, of course, it's a surprise if you have on mind the history of Latin America, because of so many American interventions, occupations, that it's really, it could be really risky. And for the United States, as far as their relations go with Latin American countries, and it could be very badly seen in many other countries. I think Juan Guaido very often speaks about he speaks about that all options are on the table, having on mind also military option. But I think it's more the pressure than the really expectation.
I'm interested on your view in terms of China having any involvement behind closed doors in some way in terms of them intervening from an economic standpoint. Because some of the Latin American countries, China has been having these contracts and dealing with them, and the United States is kind of feeling very uncomfortable by it. And I'm wondering, what's the dynamics that's happening in that part of the world in relation to the United States?
I didn't hear the beginning. Could you repeat that?
Yeah. Oh, okay. Sorry about that. China, and this possibly is involved either, behind closed doors or in some way with that part of the world, is how much involvement do they have right now? Because I know the United States is kind of really concerned about China's involvement in that part of the world.
You mean? I mean that in case of China, it's in some way behind the back. China prefers Russia to speak in case of Venezuela, and of course China can use the argument of the conflict, commercial conflict with a war with the United States. But I don't think that in case of Venezuela they would try to insist too much, because they have also many interests in other Latin American countries. So I think that they in some way they prefer to wait what Russia says and what Russia does in this context, and to be let's say in some way to express solidarity with Russia without saying this, but without expressing too strongly its position in this case.
I'm wondering whether it wouldn't be a little bit wiser or smarter if the European Union is at first plan of front activity to make change in Venezuela rather than the United States, for the historical reasons that you mentioned. It's controversial, and more probably Brazil, but Brazil is now a very specific moment, but there are so many countries that might have much more influence, positive influence on Maduro than Donald Trump. I understand that the posture of the US is to be first, but I'm not sure whether this is so effective to say that I do not recognize, as President Trump said, I do not recognize Mr. Maduro. I recognize Juan Guaido, but sometimes this plays a reversal role, in fact, and it's unproductive. What is your opinion on that?
Well, as I said, most of the EU countries have recognized Guaido as interim president, although they didn't stop the communication with Maduro's government, in the meaning that, for instance, as we had this in Poland, we recognize interim as an interim head of state Guaido, but there is still the ambassador appointed by Maduro. He has still his residence and he's staying here in Warsaw. So we don't press in any form in any way. The same do other countries. Our situation is a specific one because we don't have ambassador in Caracas. We have chargé d'affaires, so it's not reciprocal situation. But the main players like Spain, like Portugal, like Italy. Although Italy, for instance, Italy is an example because it didn't recognize Guaido. Maybe some of the reasons. Although there are clearly political reasons among there's a quarrel between the political parties, but maybe there is also the reason which Ambassador Schnepp mentioned, because they had such big communities, so they would prefer to search some mediation and possibility of mediation. I don't know, but most of the EU countries are not so strong. Don't express in such strong way, like mentioned Lima Group or the United States. We would rather prefer to really have be mediators in this conflict, but unfortunately, on the other hand, as the experiences show, the Maduro made use of all the mediations, because there are many intents of ex-prime minister of Spain, for instance, which were absolutely which didn't bring any result. Contrary, they permitted Maduro to make more propaganda, to make only appearances that there is a dialogue, and in fact there was no progress at all. So it seems that it's from his part is only like playing to gain more time. So it's really not easy. Anyway, this international contact group mentioned haven't finished its work, and I hope that maybe in some way, having on mind all these links between Europe and Venezuela, especially these three countries, I mean Spain, Portugal, and Italy. In fact, these three countries during so many years during the Chavez government, still Chavez government, during Bolivarian Revolution, they were against any sanctions because of the communities they had there. So they were very aware of their people in Venezuela. Now they changed their position because the situation is so critical that the pressure must be stronger and stronger on Maduro's regime. But let's hope that all this common history, can be useful and can help and can make the EU countries apport some positive efforts in resolving the conflict, the crisis.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador, for your presentation. I apologize for being late. I was looking forward to this event the whole week, but in the end, I just couldn't make it on time. But if I could ask you, for your opinion as a diplomat, how would you assess the position of the situation of Latin America, broadly speaking? regarding its political events that have been taking place in the region for the last 30 years. It's the end of the Washington consensus almost everywhere, including Mexico. We have seen the end of the so-called pink tide. And now Venezuela is unraveling into something that some people see could be a replica of Syria. In your opinion, as a diplomat, because you have been exposed to all these people and events, how would you assess then Latin America at this time in the 21st century? And if you don't mind, another quick question. What could be then the areas of interest for Poland in Latin America, diplomatically speaking? Thank you.
Well, started with the second part, with the second answer, which is maybe easier. So we traditionally, our main partners are Brazil, as far as economic relations go, are Brazil, Mexico, Argentina. We strongly believe that the good relations with Pacific Alliance can bring good results. We have firmed the declaration, Poland and Mexico, that we would like to have a strategic partnership as quickly as possible. In fact, Mexico is the main destination of our exports in Latin America, although the biggest commercial partner is Brazil. But these countries are, let's say, and Pacific Alliance and Brazil and Argentina are the countries with which we traditionally we hope we could do much more to have much bigger exchange. In fact, our commercial exchange with Latin America is more or less 4 times less than the commercial exchange of the average commercial exchange of the EU with Latin America. So there's a lot to be done. We have no political conflicts with any Latin American countries. We have really good relations. We have consultations at the level of very regular consultations at the level of deputy foreign affairs ministers. We have also opened the recently 2 years ago the embassy in Panama. We would like to have better relations with Central America also, starting making use of our embassy in Panama. There are some like-minded countries, traditional, like Panama, like Costa Rica. Even with Mexico, we had always very good political dialogue. Now, speaking about your first question, in which point is the Latin America now? So obviously, it's in a turning point because the Latin Americans were tired with leftist governances, obviously, and in many countries, conservatives came again to the power. Traditional, maybe. This is the case of Brazil. This is the case of Colombia. This is the case of Chile and other countries. Maybe the exception is Mexico, where Morena won the election and is really strong half year after their triumph. President Andrés Manuel López Obrador has really a strong position. and this is the exception in its leftist coalition, but it's also similar, like in Brazil, that this is not traditional party. I mean, in both countries, traditional, it happens something maybe similar, like in other parts of the world, that people are tired with traditional parties. Unfortunately, there is also they are tired of democratic institutions. So I mean, they don't believe it's according to the investigations, the polls. Most Latin Americans, I mean, the number of Americans who don't consider the democracy as something important is increasing. There are much more confidence, for instance, in militaries, and it happens in many Latin American countries, and in church than in democracy. So obviously there are changes. We don't know in which direction finally they will go. But also in many Latin American countries we could see the same what happens in other parts of the world, that the presidential candidates make their campaigns through internet more than in a traditional way. It happened in many countries. The best example, Bolsonaro, who was all the time on Twitter, Instagram, and so on. So there are very interesting things which are going on. I hope that the lost decade will not repeat in the history of Latin America. Although the development of in general of Latin America this year will be not so strong. It will be less than 2%. In part, very bad results, economic results of the whole region. Responsible of them, in fact, is Venezuela in big part. But Mexico also has not so good GDP growth. The same with Brazil, but they are on good way, I hope. So.
Just a very short question about the more connected with, let's say, personalities, because we deal with Juan Guaido. Is he really the man? Is he really the leader to manage the situation? I still remember the awe, actually, that my Brazilian friends were watching transmission, right, TV transmission from what was going on during the alleged coup d'etat, right, that he bid on. And the first impression, and what they did actually, what they said, I mean, the first reaction was, is he crazy? I mean, how is it possible for him to underestimate the strength of the military sector and to say publicly that he can count on whatever, right? That anybody would support him in that. And then I was just thinking, is he experienced enough? I mean, is he really the leader who can get Venezuela out of the slump, right? Thank you.
Well, he became, as I said, he's 35 years old only, and let's say the leader of Voluntad Popular, of popular will, let's say, is Leopoldo Lopez, and he is much more experienced, of course, and there are many more leaders, Venezuelan leaders who are more experienced, but unfortunately, they are under arrest, or they had to flee, or they are not on the spot. And if Guaido had the possibility, maybe a little bit by some coincidences, he got to be the president of the speaker or president of the General Assembly, Then he was considered in certain moment at that time in January, he was considered as a kind of symbol of the man who can make people make the whole opposition and the people who support the opposition, make them feel once again together. It seemed at that moment in January that I was really optimistic that there is no that they can't go, that Venezuela can't go back. No passes can't make passes back. That this is the moment when the whole opposition once again is united. Because it's really difficult, not only because of different opinions, not only because different visions of what should be done, different errors, mistakes of the opposition, that they had different opinions, how should they act, but because of difficult circumstances. I mean, because of the repressions, because of the work of security services and so on, because many of them had to leave the country. What I can say that many EU diplomats I received, because I don't know personally Juan Guaido. I couldn't know him, of course, because he was a student at my time, still 8 years ago or 10 years ago. So in fact, he was unknown at that time. I know many more leaders of opposition, young leaders of opposition who grow from students' opposition, but it's not the case of him. He, I would say, is the fruit of the situation, and he's actually very young and not so experienced. He sent his representatives as ambassadors, for instance, to many countries. They can't be ambassadors because to have an ambassador, for instance, in Poland or in any country, first you must finish the mission of the present ambassador. And it wasn't done, nor by Maduro, nor by Guaido. In fact, if Guaido, I don't know if it's by casualty or he thought about this, but if Guaido, if he would say that, okay, I finished the mission of the present ambassador and I appoint. Here are the cards, and I appoint a new ambassador. Then it would be probably the problem for many countries. But I don't know if he, because actually it would be a very difficult legal case for the diplomats. But it's not so. It's not like this. So in fact, it's true that he's not so experienced, and many his representatives who go to other countries are also not so experienced, because most of them are people who are not in Venezuela but somewhere in Spain, in Panama, in Italy, and who had good contacts with the opposition, and they were nominated as representatives of Guaido. So let's hope that Guaido, even if he's not experienced, that he will be a good symbolic, how to say, leader who can be seen as an element of the unity.
Just to comment to this, actually, that isn't his strength, because don't get me wrong, but in 2008, when we met in Caracas, I was doing this research project, and I met with Leopoldo Lopez, for example, and you know, the opposition was still believing in him somehow, but a lot of people related him to the coup against Chavez. So he was like involved in some actions before. What I mean is that Guaido is a new person. He's fresh. He's not related to the past anyhow. And he comes from a very poor part of Venezuela, but at the same time he graduated from the academia, so he somehow combines many characteristics, and he's a new, fresh face. But relating to this, what do you think about Leopoldo Lopez? Does he still matter? Because he was like arrested, then he escaped. He's still somewhere out there, but I don't think he's a leader anymore. But what is your opinion? Does he still matter?
Well, I was, before I was nearly sure that he should be the leader. He had everything to be a leader, but now I have really strong doubts that it can happen. Even if when he left his home arrest, then he was received in Spanish, in the residence of Spanish ambassador. He looked as a different person for me. He didn't express himself like before. What he managed really was to organize popular will, but it can be difficult for him to regain his old position. The same, I think, about Capriles Radomski, who also seemed to be a strong leader before, but never more. With many leaders of traditional Venezuelan parties, I think that they will be not able to come back to the political scene.
I have a question about, do you know anything about the situation of the indigenous people that live there in Venezuela? And also, how is the climate change maybe affecting Venezuela?
Well, in case of indigenous people, they have maybe much more to even if, for instance, President Hugo Chavez spoke a lot about the rights of indigenous people. He considered the idioms of indigenous peoples as official idioms. In some way, he showed that he was doing a lot for indigenous people, President Chavez, but it's never more now. Totally contrary. There are many indigenous communities in the part southeast of Venezuela that were very badly treated by the soldiers, by the people who were searching for smaragds, diamonds, and so for gold, and they were treated very often with guns. And I think that there is a quite strong indigenous movement against Bolivarian government nowadays. They are among people who were who strongly suffered because of many things, because of corruption and uncontrolled exploitations of natural resources in Amazon's region, because of military involvement, because of bad dramatic health situation and food situation and so many things. Well, in case of climate, it's the same. Like maybe not so dramatic as in case of Caribbean islands, but Venezuela also faces the same problems of changes of climate. I don't know if you would like to, in which sense you would like to speak about this, but I think at this moment for Venezuelans, the problem is not the climate, but how to survive.
I just think it's intertwined.
Yeah, people should, but when you are in extreme conditions, then you try to survive having what is at your hand. I mean, you try to find food, you try to find medicines.
I know, but the climate doesn't help. I mean, the power shortages don't help, when food goes out because the refrigerators don't work and people just can't handle the heat. The water goes bad, so that's why I'm mentioning it. Also because I am wondering if maybe some oil companies are like maybe taking advantage of the crisis to, monopolize on the oil that is there. And if I can steal the microphone for a second, there's an organization. It's called Hormiguitas Guayanas, and it's on social media, on Facebook and Instagram, and you can find it. It basically helps people in Venezuela, and you can find people in Warsaw, actually. I'm one of them. I'm a daughter of a Venezuelan woman. My mom is Venezuelan, and so yeah, we organize medicine and food and clothes. So if you can donate, it would be great. You can look for Hormiguitas Guayanas. It means ants in Guayanas, ants, let's say. That means that people there help people in need. So if you're wondering how to help specifically, that's how you can do it. Sorry, thank you.
I think it is important to help anyway. That's what we said about the humanitarian aid, that no matter what happens, it should be provided, right? Okay, we have a space for last question, I think.
I just wanted to ask you, so if you, would you see any similarities between Venezuela and Poland? I mean, when it comes to social benefits distribution, which preceded the crisis, and or it's just senseless prediction, or it might be just our fate in a couple of years.
But
I mean, the level of populism during Chavez era, and then what followed.
You would like me to speak about the parallels, some parallels with Poland, or?
I'm just wondering, so if it's too far to think like that, so just well, it might be a warning.
well, I am not the politician to. My business is not national politics in Poland. I rather prefer to concentrate on foreign policy and on the situation in other countries than to speak about the situation in Poland.
Mr. Ambassador, we talked about China influence, about Russian influence, but also you have experience with Cuba. I would like to ask, what do you think, because you said there is some officers in the Venezuelan army who are helping to keep that army with Maduro. What do you think? Do you believe there is any key, there is any possibility to find the solution for that crisis also on the island, in the Cuba?
Well, no, but Cuba depends on Venezuela, and it's not from our point of view is not the player, because Cuba simply receives. Because now it's much more reduced. Cuba used to receive like 100,000 barrels per day of even more of Venezuelan petrol. Now if it comes to 40, 50,000, that's all. But still it goes, they receive. So it's really strange from the point of view of, and it's really offending. It can offend Venezuelan people because they have no resources, and they still give the Maduro's regime gives petrol to Cuba. Cuba and Venezuela, they have strong relations, but Cuba is not the I mean, in the meaning of broader politics, Cuba is not the player. Cuba, in this case, can only help to Maduro to maintain in order the army. But on the other hand, there are many Venezuelan officials who really don't like the situation that Cuban officers are commanding. So Cuba is also pressured very strongly by the United States, because it goes in two directions. I mean, the United States pressure Venezuela, and at the same time Cuba. But I think that we can't expect from Cuba. They will leave as quickly. They will leave as soon as there will be they will have to leave, because there will be no option. But until they can stay in Venezuela, and until they can try to influence, try to maintain Maduro at power, they will do this. But as quickly as it's impossible, they will retreat from Venezuela.
Well, thank you very much. We didn't expect, I'm afraid, so many of you. It is, well, we are glad, and it is so incredible for us that despite the great weather outside, you decided to come here to spend the afternoon with us. But unfortunately, the souvenirs that our guest brought, well, I think will not be enough for all of you.
But the publications are in Polish, so it can be useful for people who don't speak Polish.
Okay, but anyway, if you would
anyway,
like to
anybody who is interested in this, it's about Poland in Latin America and the Caribbean, and it's about the links of Poland with this region of the world. So please, you can take
one.
Each person.